Okay, we are picking up the lecture on the axial skeleton where we left off last. Um, okay, so functions of the axial skeleton. Remember, the axial skeleton is the skull, which consists of the cranium and the facial bones, and um, it's also the rib cage, and it's also the spinal cord. Okay, so functions are that it supports and protects the brain, supports and protects the spinal cord, and protects organs in the ventral body cavity, specifically the heart and the lungs. Another thing the axial skeleton does is provide a surface area for attachment of certain skeletal muscles, the ones that move the head, the neck, and the trunk. Um, and it helps perform respiration. Well, the muscles that help perform respiration, because um, um, those muscles, a lot of them are attached to the ribs or the spinal cord, and the muscles that stabilize elements of the appendicular skeleton. And primarily, the axial skeleton houses the brain and the sense organs. Okay, so these are very small, and I just really want to go over the top one. So let's see if I can blow this up. Control plus, there we go. Okay, I really just want to go over the top one because you can see the bones better here. I may go over a few bones from the other view, but anyway, the large bone here, I hope you can see my cursor. Anyway, the large bone right here at the forehead is called the frontal bone, and the parietal bones are just behind the frontal bone. There's two of them, here and here, and they go all the way back until they meet up with the occipital bone, which I don't think you can see from this view. Let's see, the temporal bone is right there at your temples, there and there. The I think that's all that you can see of the of the cranium. So let's look at the facial bones. We'll start with the mandible down here at the bottom, which is the jawbone, the lower jawbone, and then the maxilla, which is the upper jawbone. It goes all the way up where it meets with the cheeks, and then it goes up into the or on the sides of the nasal cavity. Your nasal bones are here. There's two of them. And there is a very important bone that separates, it forms the floor of the cranium, and it kind of separates the cranium from the facial bones. And that is, if you can see back here, this bone is the purple bone. It's called the sphenoid bone. Here's a part of it, here's a part of it, here, and here is a part of it, the sphenoid bone. And then you have the ethmoid bone in green, and you can see some of that ethmoid bone in here in the nasal cavity. So the ethmoid bone is in green. The palatine bone, you cannot see much of it. These two little places where it's connected to the ethmoid bone. And the lacrimal bone is actually up here between the maxilla and the ethmoid. So between the maxilla and the ethmoid is the lacrimal bone. Let's see what else we're missing here. The zygomatic bone is your cheekbones. So you have, those are in blue. All right, now as far as particular areas of bone that I want you to know, the ethmoid bone contains the middle nasal concha and the inferior nasal concha are located here and here. What the nasal concha do is they help the air to kind of circulate through your nasal cavity. They cause it to not flow in a straight path, but the air has to move over these kind of projections, and so it causes that air to circulate in the nasal cavity, and it warms the air as it comes in. So the warmer the air is, the more oxygen that can be dissolved in it. Okay, we also have some foramens, which are little holes that are passageways for blood vessels and nerves. In the maxilla, we have the infraorbital foramen here and here, and that's because this is the orbit. They're actually inferior to the orbit, so that's why they're called infraorbital foramen. And then the supraorbital foramen are here and here in the eyebrow regions because they are superior to the orbit or the eye socket. Let's see. The sutures. Okay, the sagittal suture separates the two parietal bones. The coronal suture separates the parietal bones from the frontal bone. The see if there's another suture. No, those are the only two sutures that you can see. The mastoid process here it's just a process that is part of the temporal bone. The optic canal is here, and there's another one over here. Optic canals. Let's see. And then the vomer right there, and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid is here. Okay, as far as the inferior view of the skull, just so that you can see the sphenoid bone. So this is like you have the skull turned upside down and you're looking at the bottom of the skull or the inferior part of the skull. So you can see a little more of the palatine bone here. You can see a little bit more of the maxilla. This is the occipital bone here. And you can see the mastoid process of the temporal bone. You can see the styloid process of the temporal bone, which is like a little spike. Let's see. And then the ethmoid bone, I don't know if they've labeled it on here or not, but the ethmoid bone, you can see part of that here and here. Okay, so let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. Oops. Okay, so the frontal bone forms the forehead and the roof of the orbits or the eye sockets. It contains the supraorbital foramen. A foramen is a hole or passageway through bone, and this one is a passageway above each eye socket or orbit for blood vessels and nerves. I do want you to know the sinuses. They're called the paranasal sinuses. There's the frontal sinuses. And what the sinuses do is they are air-filled cavities that reduce the weight of the skull. Okay, and the parietal bones, those are the ones that are located kind of behind or posterior to the frontal bone. There's two of them, and they are attached to the frontal bone. the line that separates the two parietal bones is called the sagittal suture, and the line that separates, or the joint, is that these are actually joints. Sutures are joints, but they're immovable joints. The coronal suture separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones, from both of the parietal bones. Then we have the occipital bone, which contains, well, it's separated from the parietal bones by the lambdoid suture, and it contains the foramen magnum, which literally means a large hole, and that is the passageway for the spinal cord, the brain and the spinal cord, the brain stem, the part that meets up. This is the hole to where the brain can connect to the spinal cord. And then you have the occipital condyles, which articulate with the first vertebra. Let's see if I can show you those. I'm not sure if I can or not, but yeah, here we go. The occipital condyles are a different color. They're here and here, and these articulate with the atlas, which is your very first cervical vertebra. Let's see, the temporal bones articulate with the parietal bones at the squamous suture. So the squamous suture separates the parietal bones from the temporal bones. And there are some important markings on the temporal bones. Another thing is that they house the bones of the middle ear called the auditory ossicles, and they contain the external acoustic meatus, which is what we know as the ear canal, the outer ear canal. There is a mandibular fossa where the temporal bone articulates with the mandible. There's a mastoid process and a styloid process that I mentioned to you before. And here what you see is the view of the skull. If you were to cut through it, like make a cut through it like this is a transverse cut, and then turn it upside down and look at the underneath of it. Okay, so you can see your occipital bone, you can see your temporal bones here, and the sphenoid you can really see very well. This is the sphenoid bone. You can see the frontal bone very well, and you can see the ethmoid bone. The sphenoid bone forms basically the floor of the cranium, separates the cranium from the facial bones. It acts as a bridge uniting the facial bones. And it contains a pair of sinuses called the sphenoidal sinuses. So, so far we've mentioned that there are sinuses in the frontal bone. Now we know that there are sinuses in the sphenoid bone. Now, there is a bone marking called the sella turcica, which is very important. The sella turcica of the sphenoid bone houses and protects the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is part of the endocrine system that produces many hormones that kind of regulate other hormones of the immune system. They're regulatory hormones. All right, the ethmoid bone contains the ethmoidal sinuses. And I don't go over all of the bone markings, but I did mention to you about the nasal concha, and that their purpose was to slow the airflow down, moisten and warm the air as it comes into you, as you breathe it in, so that it can dissolve more oxygen. You can get more oxygen.